being here. So last time, most of you were here, but a couple people weren't, so welcome. If you, as we were just saying, if you haven't had a chance to look, the first session is online. And we'll be recording all of these, so if you do need to miss one, you're welcome to come back and view it that way. Welcome. Hi, Janet. So last time I talked a little bit about children of Abraham, so basically Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I want to kind of finish that just a little bit by just saying a few more things about Judaism and a few things about Islam, and then we'll get into the early church today. I wanted to just real briefly go to kind of today's biggest divisions in Judaism. There's a ton of things we could talk about in terms of Judaism, but that's not the main point of the class. But I think it's interesting just to kind of look at a few of the big things that exist today. Orthodox and Reform Judaism is the easiest way to kind of put Judaism into different categories. One thing I'd never really thought about is where that came from, and I had just assumed that that was something that's been going on for centuries. But it's actually fairly recent. The main difference between Orthodox and Reform is Orthodox kind of says the Torah came from God himself and cannot be modified, whereas the Reform is more that there's some flexibility allowed in interpretation of the Torah. And ways that manifests itself are men and women sitting together. That's very common in Reform and not common in Orthodox. There's also female rabbis in Reform. The first female rabbi was actually 1935. So compared to the Lutheran tradition, our first female pastor was 1970. So that was 35 years before we got around to that. The Reform movement started in Berlin and then kind of quickly moved to Hamburg. And there were two things that kind of kicked things off, really. And I should say this is like early 1800s, so it wasn't that long ago. And the Reform movement kind of started as a response to modernity. There were just things happening in the world that was hard for some people in Judaism to kind of reconcile with the teachings. So two things kind of kicked things off. One of them was a new prayer book was issued. And one of the things that the prayer book omitted was the phrase, "O gather our dispersions, conduct us unto Zion." So before that prayer book, there was still this focus on Jerusalem and Israel and how, someday that will come back and will be the focus of the religion. And the Reform movement kind of looked at that and said, that's not really going to happen. Well, it kind of did in a way, but that's not something we need to strive for as a base part of our religion. The other thing that they did was they opened a new place of worship. One thing that they did was they called this a temple and not a synagogue. And that was significant because at that time, the temple was Jerusalem. Even though there wasn't a temple, that was just kind of the focus. So a lot of conservative rabbis just kind of lost it. And that turned into what they called the Hamburg Temple disputes. There were two of them, or they kind of classify in two ways, 1818 to 1821 and 1841 to 1842. But that was what really kind of cemented this division between Orthodox and Reform, and that's persisted to this day. There's lots more distinctions, of course, in Judaism, and I don't want to get too far down into the weeds, but the Jews in Israel would, almost without exception, define themselves into one of these four categories. From the top to the bottom, getting more liberal as you go down. To give you an idea, the first one kind of to the right at 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock there is the most conservative, and then it gets less conservative as you go around. One way they talk about this is just an example of what it means to be conservative is public transportation. Should public transportation run on the Sabbath? And so you look at that first group, that 9% there, almost without exception, everybody would, in that group would say, no, absolutely not, no public transportation on the Sabbath. You get to the next group, and it's still the vast, vast majority, but a little bit of wavering. When you get to the third group, now it's pretty much split down the middle. And then you get to that last group, and the vast majority of those folks would say, sure, no problem. And you get to that last group, and you're also getting into a lot of people who identify as Jewish, but are not terribly religious. So there's a little variation there. And then just one other way of kind of looking at Judaism is Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And so that's the difference of where Jews kind of dispersed out of the Mideast and where they settled in. So the Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews of France, Germany, and Eastern Europe. And Sephardic Jews are the Jews of Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and the Middle East, and of course, all their descendants. So the first Jews in the US were actually Sephardic. This goes back to colonial times. There were immigrants from Portugal who created the first synagogues in the United States. But today, 90 to 95% of US Jews are Ashkenazi. And then just real quickly, the Yiddish language. A lot of people kind of associate Yiddish language as being this international Jewish language. But it's not really. What it really is a Ashkenazic language. There is actually the equivalent for a Sephardic language, and that is Ladino. Yiddish is based on German and Hebrew, and Ladino is based on Spanish and Hebrew. So it's a real parallel there. So I think that's about all I'm going to go with Judaism. Is there any questions or thoughts at that point? So if not, talk just a little bit about Islam. Muhammad was born in 571, so there's an awful lot of Christian history that happened before Islam. Excuse me, one sec. So he was born in 571 in Mecca, and starting at age 40, he reported getting revelations from God through the Archangel Gabriel. And he started to preach about that. He started to gather followers, and eventually he became the last Islamic prophet. So there are, I think it's 25 prophets in Islam. Adam is one. Abraham, we talked about that last time. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, I'm skipping a whole bunch. John the Baptist, Jesus, and then the very last one is Muhammad. So he lived in an area that was not, Judaic or not Christian. Polytheism was the rule in that area where he grew up. After he started kind of spreading his word, he was persecuted. He and his followers went to Medina, grew in strength, gathered more and more followers, got to the point where he created an army, went back to Mecca, and succeeded on the battlefield. And eventually kind of united the tribes of Arabia, at least religiously, but to a large extent politically. The Muslims didn't waste a lot of time dividing themselves. When Muhammad died in 632, the Muslims couldn't agree on who should be the new leader. So the big division was, should this be a relative, from the line of Muhammad, or should it be the best possible candidate? And that has turned into the Sunni and Shia divide. So you can trace Sunni and Shia back to just after the time of Muhammad. Shia is the line of where they feel that the leader should come from the line of Muhammad. When we look at the Middle East, this is one thing that I feel if our politicians and our generals had a better understanding of this divide, we'd be in a lot better shape. Everything over the last, certainly 100 years in that part of the world, you have to look at through the lens of this divide. There was a very long time where, for the most part, Sunni and Shia were able to kind of coexist. There were certainly flare-ups, but for the most part it wasn't that bad. But over the last 100 years, that's become a very strong point of conflict. So looking at the map here a little bit, Iran is predominantly Shia. Iraq has a majority. There's a few other countries that are largely Shia, but most of the Arab world is Sunni dominated. In terms of percentage, I don't have that figure here, but it's probably 80 to 85% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. But the Shia are represented in some very key ways, in a way that gives them power that perhaps is outsized compared to their numbers. So one of the things that, is a good example of this is Saddam Hussein. Does anybody know what Saddam Hussein is? Sunni or Shia? To a certain extent, this is my point. The fact that we don't know this is startling, and I didn't really think about it until I started looking into it, because this explains an awful lot of the friction in that part of the world. As you can see from the map, it's a Shia majority country. Saddam Hussein is Sunni. And so he's in a position, or he was in a position where for him to stay dominant, he had to do everything he possibly could to suppress the majority. And that, of course, is going to cause lots of friction, tension, conflict. One of the ways he did that was to basically tell the country that Sunni were the dominant force, or were the largest force the largest population in Iraq, when that simply wasn't the case. But he kept saying it long enough that to this day you can go to Iraq and ask people which, are there more Sunnis or Shia? People will say more Sunnis, even though it's just absolutely not true. We can look at, Saudi Arabia, which is very much Sunni, and we can see how they are interfering in the politics of other countries, and very often it's because of the Sunni-Shia divide. I should also just say, if you're curious, in the US, probably 55% are Sunni, 16% are Shia. Well, that leaves a whole bunch left. So those are folks who would not identify with either group. That's something we have the luxury of doing in the United States, of not getting that bogged down. Now, some people do. They get involved in that politics in a big way. But also we have things like the Nation of Islam. That is a very specific movement that does not go into the Sunni-Shia divide, or tries not to. And we do have non-denominational Muslims. Any thoughts or questions about that before we kind of get into early Christianity? All right. So, I want to talk a little bit about the Council of Jerusalem. So the Council of Jerusalem is generally dated to about 48 AD. So this is only like 15 to 20 years after Jesus was crucified. And the meeting was called to debate whether or not Gentiles who were converting to Christianity needed to be circumcised. So I want to read just a little bit from Acts 15, just to kind of set the stage here a little bit. So, then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and as they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, they reported the conversion of the Gentiles and brought great joy to all the believers. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said, "It is necessary for them to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses." I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And so, let's see here. So this is James who's speaking here. Therefore I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. And so this might not be translated so great. I think maybe instead of "I have reached the decision," it would be more along the lines of "I have a very strong opinion that." There's a little bit of question about that, but basically this was the first recorded instance of the church as it existed as a whole getting together and trying to hash out some of the questions of the day. And it's interesting for that. The fact that it happened so quickly after Jesus' crucifixion means that people who were attending this, some of them knew Jesus, they were certainly, living at the same time of Jesus. So until I really started looking at it, I had been aware that this existed, but it was really interesting to me that this happened just so quickly, and that there was an infrastructure in place that they could have this type of meeting so soon after Christianity kind of became a thing. So the result of this really set in place then how Gentiles were absorbed into the Christian church. So it's the first case of really codifying that this was not just a Jewish religion, and here's how we're going to go forward with that. So I want to ask the question, when did Christianity become a distinct religion? Does anybody want to throw out any thoughts on that? There's not a right answer. It's a tricky one. One of the things that confuses things too, that old adage that history is written by the victor. There's a little bit of that here too when it comes to, a lot of the history we have of the early church is defined through, what became the Roman Catholic Church. We obviously have this from the Bible here, but just in terms of the way it's talked about, if you kind of hear a Roman Catholic talk about even this, they might use the words bishops, and they might talk about a diocese, people from different dioceses came to. And I'm not sure that the people contemporary of that would have been thinking in those terms. So we tend to take how the church evolved and then apply it to this point very long ago. But, I mean, this was an incredibly significant moment where you had people from a fairly large geographic area meeting to discuss issues of the day. In terms of my actual question of a distinct religion, you know, this certainly feels like Christianity. You can kind of wrap your hands around, and it feels good, and it's easy to hold. But there's evidence that there were Christians who were worshiping in Jewish temples into the 4th century. So there was an awful lot of mixture that would go on for a couple hundred years after this, where it was a little bit hard to make those distinctions. And we have a little evidence of that when they mention the Pharisees here. Go ahead.
It's ironic that these words are written in Acts by Luke, writing late in the 1st century. So he's I mean, there are, in a sense, two audiences to the text.
Right.
The historical one, as you say earlier, now he's writing late in the 1st century. And when you read the whole of Acts, Paul is, from chapter 9 on, such a critical figure. And it's clear Luke is making the case for Paul and the Gentile, increasingly Gentile church.
Yes.
And you're exactly right. I mean, this didn't happen just one day in one place where the church became the church independent from Judaism.
No, and I think it's important, you know, that Luke had an agenda as well in the way he described this meeting. And we don't have a description that is 100% contemporary. It's close, but not quite.
Late in the 4th century, there was a deacon, later to become a bishop in the church, who wrote several sermons where he castigated his congregation about engaging in Jewish practices. That was somehow not Christian, which suggests people were doing this. And this is into the 4th century, as you point out.
Right, right. So, you know, a result of this was almost certainly a schism. We have a hard time pinning it down exactly, but there were certainly people who did not agree with the result of this, and felt that the Christian religion must be for Jews, or at best, people who conformed exactly to Hebraic law. And we don't hear an awful lot about that, but we have enough evidence to suggest that that certainly was the case. Then going from there, oh, and then I just wanted to say this is a little bit later in the chapter. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul decided not to take with them one who had deserted them and had not accompanied them in the work. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and set out, the believers commending him to the grace of the Lord. He even went through Syria. Okay, so basically the point is another schism. They couldn't figure out, you know, how to get along with one particular personality, and so they wound up going in different directions. And so I just point that out to show that, you know, we don't think about how many times disagreements really derailed the work of the early Christian fathers. So I kind of asked that question. One of the big things that, you know, really made a huge difference was the destruction of the Second Temple. Now this happened after that meeting in Jerusalem. So this happened in 70 AD. And it kind of in one fell stroke eliminated a lot of the Jewish sects. We talked a little bit about this last time. The Zealots, the Sadducees, the Essenes, all pretty much ceased to exist not long after the destruction of the temple. So that kind of cleaned up a lot of the different divisions and focused things much more on the Pharisees, which kind of became the rabbinical Jewish tradition, and the early Christians. And again, there was a lot of overlap between the Pharisees and the early Christians, but it cleaned up some of those divisions. One of the things that really divided the Jews and the Christians was their perspective on why the destruction of the temple actually happened. From the perspective of Judaism, many of them saw the destruction as a chastisement for neglecting the Torah. Christians, on the other hand, were likely to see it as God's punishment for the Jews rejecting Jesus. So when you take a life-altering, incredibly major event and come at it from two different perspectives, that starts really dividing things in a way that hadn't happened previously. Now, like we said, that would go on for hundreds of years where it wasn't necessarily, there was still a lot of overlap. But that, I think, is a key moment in planting the seeds for making that division. One of the things that then kind of became a thought process in a lot of Christians' minds was the idea of what we call today supersessionism. So the idea being that Christianity was the logical continuation of Judaism, and it supplants Judaism. The Muslim faith does the exact same thing, but with both Christianity and Judaism. So the Muslim faith feels that they're the logical extension of those two religions, and that they're the one true religion and everything else, is no longer valid. That's also called replacement theology. So that's a place to take another break. Is there any thoughts or questions on that? All right. If not, I will keep plowing ahead here. So I'm really impressed by the number of times the leaders of the church got together to try to hash out a lot of these issues. And I think the number of these different councils where people were gathering is indicative of how many different ideas there were that were floating around that, they needed to kind of figure out. Now, one thing that helped a little bit was the Roman Empire kind of joining the fray. Because with the Roman Empire creating Christianity as a state church, there was a real incentive for the Romans to consolidate. It's a real advantage if you're trying to run an empire to have everybody worshiping the same way, the same God, doing things, the same traditions. It creates one less thing for there to be friction and strife about. It creates one less avenue for revolution. So there is a lot of benefits. So a lot of these councils were actually pushed by the Romans to kind of like, okay guys, you figure it out. Let us know what you think. We'll, but just make sure we come up with one idea and then we can go forward. And then because of all of these different councils, we started to get all these schisms. So whenever you have a bunch of people who get together and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it, then there's people who disagree with that. And obviously we're not going to go through all of these, but there are a lot. And this is, this one page is just 150 150, 180 years there. So an awful lot of disagreements and divisions and what have you. But I do want to talk about a few of the biggies. First Council of Nicaea, where do people know the word Nicaea from? Exactly, yep. So look a little bit here at just some of the branches and how things divided. We'll talk more about this, so you'll see this again. But this gives you an idea of how we kind of got to where we're going. I just wanted to throw that up to give a little bit of overview as to where we're going. But going back to the First Council of Nicaea, the main idea there was to talk about the nature of God the Son and his relationship to God the Father. And so when we say the creed today, a lot of those words were exactly from this council. They worked very hard on identifying exactly how we need to be thinking about those things. This was called by Constantine. He was the kind of first emperor who really tolerated and then kind of drove Christianity to a large extent. So the main accomplishments of this were to, like I say, kind of figure out the nature of God the Son, the relationship to God the Father. At that time, by 325, there were 1,800 bishops in the Christian church in the Roman Empire. About 1,000 in the East and 800 in the West. So in terms of the numbers who actually attended this, there's lots of different numbers out there, but it was probably somewhere between 250 and 320. So it's quite a large number of people coming from all different parts of the empire to talk about those issues. So one of the things that this led to was a division with Arius, who claimed that Jesus Christ was created. And since he was begotten, he was not made. He argued that Jesus Christ was created out of nothing or out of something else. But the council affirmed that he was begotten, that's the word from the creed, out of the substance of the Father. Let's see here. So Aryanism then was something that kind of existed for, did I skip ahead? I think I might have skipped ahead a little bit.
What's
I'm getting my councils mixed up, I think.
Well, Aryanism was critical in the Nicene debate.
Okay, so I didn't skip ahead there. I think I'm okay. And so that was a schism that, there were definitely people who did not go along with the main body of the church and went into, a separate division, that is called Aryanism. And there are still some echoes of that idea today. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just say a few words about what Aryanism was or what they believed?
So the main difference is the nature of Christ. So was Christ begotten of the Father, not made, or was Christ created by God, or not quite at the same level? Am I saying that well?
No, I think you're on the right track. It is interesting if you go back to just the New Testament itself. The beginning of Romans, Paul says, in effect, Jesus was declared Christ at his resurrection. If you go to Matthew and Luke, it's at his birth. If you go to John, He's there from the beginning.
Right.
So you can see the conversation starting very early on about the nature of Christ, or Jesus and Christ, relationship to God, and when he becomes Messiah. And the Nicene Creed and Aryanism and the debate continues that on. Begotten, not made, all of that kind of language, which seems very foreign to us today, but it's struggling with that issue of what is the nature of Christ, how is Christ related to God, and if you were to ask Constantine, the new emperor, what his issues are, he's probably not concerned about the theological debates. He wants to, as you said earlier, keep his empire united. And he doesn't want the Christians fighting with each other, because that contributes to more chaos and political disunity. So he's got them in a room, and he wants them to decide, and that will be it. It doesn't end up quite that way, because in 389 they're going to come back again, and they meet in the Council of Constantinople to iron out some further issues. Right. So I think you're kind of on the you're basically on the right track, and we don't need to get bogged down in all of these.
What I was going to say, Paul, what Jim said there was when Constantine I became the emperor, he was surprised at the division within the Christian faith.
Yeah.
So part of his motivation, as Jim said, was the political one. He wanted a united empire. So he forces them to come together to some sort of agreement as well. I would, I don't need to hold this. I would take the division here between Aryanism is on the divinity or the humanity of Jesus.
Right.
Arium said he was divine. They discounted his humanity. So when he was nailed to the cross, he didn't suffer. He was already divine and all. So there was no human suffering involved with that. And the church said, no, that's not possible. He did suffer with that. And as Jim has already you kind of do see that from Paul to at least Matthew, Luke, and then to John. You can pick which verse you want to quote on this. And argue that way. So
yeah, no, and I feel like Constantine gets a little bit too much credit from Christian quarters. I tend to look at him as from a kind of cynical standpoint. One of the things I think is interesting about him is his baptism. He was baptized, but right at the end of his life. And one of the ways that that's kind of put forth is that he wanted to make sure that he was kind of cleansing sins in the last possible moment to give him the best chance of heaven. But a slightly more cynical way of looking at that is, he just kind of saw this as this get out of jail free card. And if you only have one, you want to play it at the last possible moment, right? But I do think that he was motivated by politics far more than religion, but that's open to debate. In terms of, echoes of this dispute today, there are people who say that the Church of Latter-day Saints are Arians. That might be a little dicey, but there's some echoes there. And there's also Unitarian Universalists who have some influences from that. So some of the distinctions that the Arians made kind of continue on today a little bit. I want to keep going here. Again, I'm going to have to skip a whole ton of councils and stuff like that. You mentioned the Constantinople one. Ephesus was, I think it was after the Constantinople, and also kind of reinforced some of the things that were at the previous one. But that kind of formed after the Council of Ephesus. There was the Nestorian schism. So Nestorian Christianity is kind of the Church of the East So it's starting to show us this east-west divide. The main body of the church in the east didn't break off at this point, but it started to go in that direction. And Nestorianism emphasized the distinction between Christ's human and divine nature. So it's still some of the same type of argument, but getting a little bit more fine-pointed. So a Nestorian thought that Mary, for example, should be called, and there's a particular word in another language, but the Christ bearer, whereas the main body of believers would use the word God bearer. So they're making this distinction between just how equal or not equal is Christ to God. So it's, again, some of the same argument, but putting a finer point on it.
Paul, it is interesting. If you look at what happens with the Pharisees become rabbinic Jews and so on, the debates there are over Torah and the meaning of Torah.
Right.
You got the other group over here, the Christ followers and the church, Christianity, and the debates are over, to a large extent, how should we understand Christ? True man, true God, whatever, some of this, little of that, none of that. Those are the debates. So what is at the center of the religion becomes the issue of debate, the point of debate.
Right. And again, we get a lot of this history from the Roman Catholic Church. So they're willing to acknowledge that there was this debate, but they frame things in the way that they want to frame them. So I think, there may have been more strife and stress and whatnot than you might see by reading a Wikipedia article on these types of things. There was a lot going on. Don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to kind of zip through here. Another one, Council of Chalcedon. This was also invoked by a Roman emperor. This was attended by 520 bishops, so these are getting kind of large. And this again was to go back and reassert the doctrine of the Council of Ephesus, to kind of keep the Nestorians down. Again, it shows you that this was not one unified body marching boldly forward. There were just continual disputes, and things would get closer and then fall apart again, and a little closer and fall apart again. But the main result of this was for the Church of Alexandria to break away. And they're today known as the Coptic Orthodox Church. So when you hear of Coptics, that's kind of when that became a self-standing group and broke away from the main body. They're the largest Christian denomination in Egypt today. And they kind of view being Coptic as their ethnic identity. So a Coptic will not consider themselves Arab, even though they live in that part of the world and share a lot of in common with Arabs. They view themselves as separate. And then, real quickly, I want to go to the Great Schism. So this is jumping quite a few years ahead. I'm skipping an enormous number of little squabbles and divisions and whatnot, but the Great Schism was the divide between East and West. So this, again, touches an awful lot on politics, and both church politics and kind of governmental politics. Ostensibly, there were supposed to be kind of 5 major geographic regions of the church. And, so Rome and Constantinople and, a bunch of other ones. That kind of didn't really work out by this time because many of those areas were now completely under Islam. So there wasn't much point in having a major part of the church have nobody there. But the 2 big survivors were Rome and Constantinople. And Rome always saw itself as the preeminent part of the church. How's that? That's interesting. We ran out of battery. Yeah, we're out of battery. Thank you. And so, Constantinople demanded to be treated in the same way as Rome, to have the same supremacy. And the best Rome could do is say, okay, we're equals, but we're first equal. And so the Great Schism is when these divided. I think I'll talk a little bit more about that next time and then move forward. But that's a good place to end now. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.